This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we talk with Memorial University anthropologist Dr. Andrea Proctor. With 20 years of experience working on community projects in Labrador, Dr. Proctor was invited by the Inuit and Innu people to record the stories which came out of the Newfoundland and Labrador healing and commemoration that followed the 2017 national apology from Prime Minister Trudeau for the pain and suffering of residential schools. Her book, A Long Journey, is an intimate and informative history that shines a light on a painful yet important part of Newfoundland and Labrador's history. We discuss the book and the legacy of residential schooling.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We want to welcome you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And cheers. My name is Rob Henderson, and I'm the rector at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
How are we doing, buddy? I'm Kevin.
Good.
Kevin George, rector of St. Aidan's Church here in northwest corner of the city, and vicar number 2 at a Vickers Crossing. I'm glad to be with you today. Somebody's missing.
Somebody's missing. Someone's absent. There's one empty box here. And who would that be? That would be producer Ian. What's going on with Ian? Ian today, Kev? I don't know.
Ian has got a mouthful of dentists right now.
A mouthful of dentists.
Yeah, right now. He has some guy or some woman up to their elbows in his mouth. So
poor guy.
Yeah, I don't think it's a emergency thing. I think it's a scheduled thing, and we had a scheduling conflict. So he said, "You guys are going to have to do this because if we had him on here now, all we get would be songs."
Right.
So we can't have that.
It sounds too much like us. So
yes, that's
we
right.
Want to do that.
Yeah.
We wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Ian, wherever you are, we hope you're
okay,
out
buddy.
of this okay, and that they stuck a lot of needles in your mouth to freeze you.
I hope so.
That could be no fun. Yeah, that could be no fun. But anyway, so me and Kevin today on the show, and today we are welcoming in a wonderful guest. Looking forward to talking to anthropologist and writer Andrea Proctor, and she's going to be with us shortly, and we're going to talk about her book, which is called A Long Journey, Residential Schools in Labrador and Newfoundland. So great topic of conversation, and she'll be joining us in a minute.
Yes, and with that in mind, this is an appropriate time for us to do a land acknowledgement here. The Vickers Crossing acknowledges that our podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenaweapuck, and Attawandaron peoples, on the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, example being First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and Innu, and we recognize them as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society. And along with people like Andrea, we work towards reconciliation and want to do whatever we can to bring about that sense of hope and healing amongst all nations.
Well, yeah, and our hope is that we take a little step in that direction today, in today's conversation, to open up and share some information and educate ourselves and our listeners. So looking forward to that. Hello to our sponsors, who we are so appreciative of, as always, here in the Vickers Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And many thanks to Dave Mullen and his staff at A. Miller George.
Hey, Dave. Thanks, buddy. We're also sending out our thanks to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally loved, locally operated. Carol Basada is the pharmacist owner over there. Beautiful, incredible person, incredible place. Switch over and see those folks today. They'll love you up forever.
Mm-hmm. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. called Molly Made London Today. Thanks to Tricia Lister and the whole gang at Molly Made for keeping Ian's room clean, but
Yeah.
also being a wonderful sponsor here in the Vickers Crossing. We thank you. All right, so we've got to play our little game, do we?
Yes,
Without
we do.
Ian. So this
Without Ian.
this might be a little too easy because you're gonna either, well, let's tell everybody what we're gonna play first, ladies and gentlemen, if you're ready, Kevin.
No, just give me 1 second.
Yeah, okay.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
See?
There it is. See, it's not a
Um,
lie
If you
if
believe
you
it.
believe it.
And now I'm not nearly as swift as Ian, but anyway.
But it works. It works. So what we're going to do is, well, Kevin today is going to tell a story about himself.
Yep.
And it's my job and you listening today to play
Yep.
along
Yep.
to try to figure out if Kevin is telling a lie or the truth. And he must remember that if it is a lie and he believes it,
Well, it's not a lie.
it's not really a lie.
Okay. So here's the story. We're talking about 1982, 1983, in and about there. And I am comfortably seated in the back seat of the 1971 Pontiac, big Pontiac car my dad had, with the 1981 Bonaire camper being towed on behind it. And back there with my other brother, Daryl. We're having a nice camping trip with mom and dad. Dad liked to take us around the island and camp in gravel pits. We didn't use provincial parks. We just went where there was a big open pit full of rocks, parked the vehicle, cranked up the camper. He left mom with her knitting needles and he went off trouting at 5 a.m. and came back in the evening. So what's it all? Such was the situation of camping in Newfoundland. So this is what we're doing. We're in the Pontiac Laurentian, cruising down the road. We're going towards Marystown, down on the boot. For those of you who are not familiar with Newfoundland, the part that looks like a big leg at the bottom down the boot, there's a town called Marystown. Dad stops to get gas, and I decide I want a bag of corn puffs and a bottle of Coke. So I said, Mom, can I have some money? Mom, give me some money. Mom. So she gave me a $2 bill. Kids, you won't remember those, but we used to have $2 bills.
Yeah.
And I ran into the Irving to get my chips and so on. Now, let me back up. Me and Daryl, sometimes we could have little arguments and fights in the back seat, and it wouldn't be uncommon for my father to say, listen, if the two of you don't knock it off, I'm going to put you out of this car and leave you here. Okay? Shut up. Right? Yeah, you can see it. You could see it. So I go into the store, I get my puffs and I get my Coke, and I'm so excited. I walk out the door, and all I see are the taillights of the 1981 Bonaire camper pulling away from the gas station across the road and driving away. He left me at the gas station.
Left you at the
He left me at the gas station. That's my story today.
That's your story. So is that true or not? Oh my gosh. Well, my first thought is I've been on a lot of road trips with Kevin, and I've too have wanted to leave with the gas station.
Yeah.
So it's really not all that far-fetched. I could, and growing up with a little brother too, I know that we spent a lot of time ducking the hand from the back seat when it swung around. Remember the hand would come back when you got a little fight going on, and mom's hand would swing back and try to snap you out of it. So with that in mind, I would think that that's probably a very true story. Very true story, Kevin.
It is a true story. Now, I have to say the caveat is that before I start getting, what kind of a father does that? My dear old dad didn't know I went into the store. And so when I came out he drove away, he didn't know I wasn't in the back seat.
Oh, yeah.
When he discovered I wasn't in the back seat, I'm told there was quite a hoopla when he was a half a mile down the road. And other brother Daryl never thought it would be a good idea to say, hey, Dad, Kevin's not back in the car.
Kevin's not back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, so were you the inspiration for the movie Home Alone?
I could be,
They left Kevin in the house?
The sight was to see me running across 4 lanes of traffic and nearly getting killed and then running down the road behind this car. Oh, tears and the whole thing. It was craziness. Absolute craziness.
But what everyone wants to know, did you get your corn pops?
I did. I got my corn puffs and my Coke. I don't remember eating them because I was too traumatized. And all I know is when I got in the car, well, there was a hitchhiker. I ran past the hitchhiker. As he was running towards the car, he thought Dad was picking him up, but he came off of the car in a hurry because Dad said something. Anyway, I got in the back seat, and all I can remember is Daryl was very sympathetic. Are you okay? Are you
Yeah.
okay?
Are
And
you
Deb
okay?
and Deb was mad as hell. Like,
Oh,
because of course his heart was breaking, because who doesn't say, if you two don't shut up, I'm going to leave you. And then he pulls away, and all that's in his mind is, I think he's left me. Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, there it is.
Well,
Not a lie if you believe it.
not a lie if you believe it. I know there's a ton of parents listening right now that probably have some story about either leaving a kid behind or forgetting something, or them getting away in the Walmart or something. All of a sudden they're disappeared,
Yep.
right? And they go awful quick. So
Yep.
that's good. That's a good story. All right, we'll have another one for you on our next edition of the Vickers Crossing. But right now, is Andrea here?
I think she's here and ready to come in. Let's bring her in.
Let's bring her in. And we are so happy to welcome Andrea Proctor to the Vickers Crossing today. How are you today, Andrea?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. It's good to see you. We were talking earlier, you're in St. John's, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Very good.
Oh, to
Very
be
good.
able to go to
And,
Newfoundland again.
Kevin's been dying to get back home for,
Look,
a year and a half. We've been in this
yeah,
pandemic. Yeah.
come from away. So Andrea, I've never gone 12 months of my life without being on the island. And this is the first time in my life I've not been there for a span of longer than 12 months, which is now at about 18 months or more, I guess, which is sort of starting to kill me. But
I know, it's hard. It's a hard
tell me,
time.
tell me you had a big feed of like Jig's dinner and salt beef and all that stuff or something in the last couple of days.
Well, actually, I just friends down from Maine, and they just brought me a partridge. So I'm gonna make
Oh,
partridge
jeez.
soup
Oh.
soon.
My
Beautiful.
goodness. Holy smokes. Well, mail something to Kevin because he's
dying.
inconsolable. Like, send him anything.
I'm dying here. The one
Good.
the one piece of good news is I did a social media campaign to get purity products into Sobeys up here, and now they're in almost all the stores. And because I was so vocal online, everybody is bringing me cream crackers and jam jams. So
Right.
I'm all set for that.
Get a life supply of them.
Listen,
great.
before we get into the book, Andrea is here, of course, to talk about the incredible work she did on A Long Journey. I wanted to ask you about something, which is look,
is.
Rob's got his copy, and thank you for that, by the way, Andrea,
Yes, thank
for
you.
getting us these. Look, hey, they're twins.
Hey, that's it.
And anyway, we'll come to that in a minute. But before we do that, I just wanted to sort of touch base on something which is pretty immediate right now in terms of when you talk about sort of reconciliation and relations between settler peoples and Indigenous peoples. Currently, the brouhaha in Newfoundland and Labrador is around a place called Indian Lake. The provincial government has introduced legislation to rename Red Indian Lake, to the Mi'kmaq phrase. I will butcher this. Do you want to try it, Andrea?
I don't
You
know.
don't know it? It's Wantatoqui Quaspum, which is a Mi'kmaq phrase that translates roughly to peaceful lake. The change is preceding plans to return the remains of a Beothuk couple, Nanasabut and Damasuit, to the area after being held in Scotland now for 200 years. And this has created some tension in the nearby communities, complaints of a lack of consultation and all that stuff. Of course, for those of us who grew up in Newfoundland, we know about those last surviving Beothuks. We were taught a version of that history in school. And the fact that these remains are being repatriated to Newfoundland is something indeed to be thankful for. And in the midst of this, it sounds as though the government is trying to make efforts to address these names like Red Indian Lake, which are insensitive. And I'm just wondering if we can get your reaction to the decision. You're an anthropologist. You're in the thick of this sort of stuff. What's the feel on the lie of the land there?
Well, as we all know, the colonial renaming of places is a very powerful, very harsh thing to do. It's a way of claiming ownership. So by naming places like Red Indian Lake is, it's obviously something that needs to change, and good for the government for doing it. But it seems like they obviously went about it in the wrong way. I don't think, from what I know, I mean, I don't know the inside story at all, but it sounds like that they didn't consult with people. They didn't talk to people about doing it. They just sort of went ahead and did it, which is a real shame, because these discussions about reconciliation, these discussions about our history, our shared history, colonial history, still ongoing examples of a colonial relationship. And they're difficult discussions to have, but they need to happen, and they take time and they take effort. So by just zipping ahead and introducing the legislation and just going ahead as the government did, misses out on that opportunity, obviously, to have those discussions. So it's a shame. They're moving in the right direction, but
consultation was lacking. And to be clear, they consulted with the sort of chief or at least the senior leadership levels of the provincial Mi'kmaq Nation, correct?
Right.
But not on the local level, if I'm understanding it right.
That's my understanding as well too. Yeah. I don't really know.
Yeah. So it's what's been interesting to me, and I think the pertinent thing is just social media is such a cesspool, is just the reaction. I mean, if you want to get a sense of why this is a problem, I don't mean the government introducing the legislation. I mean the colonialization and place names and all that stuff. You need only read the comment section of the CBC's page or any other to sort of, as I said last night, there's a lot of angry white people in Newfoundland is what I discovered on social media last night. It's like, there's some well-reasoned stuff on there where there are people saying, you know, I wish there was better consultation, but the vitriol from people who talk about cancel culture and, you know, yada, yada, as if history is being erased, when in fact, there's a whole segment of our history, as I've learned even reading your book, which has never been taught, and we're reclaiming it more than erasing it. But anyway,
well, it's a difficult discussion to have, and it as you see in those comments, there's a whole range of opinion, and we need to have these conversations.
Difficult as they are, they're absolutely necessary. Yeah. So let's talk about A Long Journey. And again, the book is available wherever you get books. We'd encourage you to go to your local booksellers if you can and support them. But if you can't, you're going to get it on Amazon and on Chapters, Indigo, all that stuff. The book is incredible. I really felt like I was given a gift when I sat and read it, being from Newfoundland and knowing what I had been taught. And seeing what I had not been taught was a real gift to me. Because as you said, we have some difficult things we need to face. And in order to do that, we really need to hear one another's stories. In reading your book, I laughed, I cried. I mean, there are really funny stories in there, and the reader gets a sense of the resilience and the strength and the dignity of the Innu and Inuit people. In many of the stories you share in this book, you can't help but get a sense of just how determined some of these folks are. At the same time, we're forced to come to grips with the painful realities of colonialism, and those are laid bare in your book as well. The book follows a long overdue apology from the federal government. Prime Minister Trudeau, in November of 2017, issued that apology. The survivors of residential schools in Labrador and Newfoundland have been left out of the 2008 apology that was made by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper. As a part of the Newfoundland Labrador Healing and Commemoration Project, which came out of that, if I'm understanding it correctly, you were asked to research the history of these schools. And in 2018, the residential school survivors from Labrador and Newfoundland participated in these forums, these community sessions where they had opportunity to talk about their experiences, to share in a safe and an empathetic environment. You attended those sessions. You heard many stories, Andrea. Can you describe what those sessions were like and how it shaped or influenced your work here?
Yeah. So yeah, as you said, the Newfoundland and Labrador Healing and Commemoration Project was led by James Igloliorte, who was a former boarding school student. He's from the coast of Labrador. He's from Hopedale. He's a retired provincial judge. So he led the project, and he led those sessions. And so for me, I've been working with Indigenous communities in Labrador for about 20 years. I'm well aware, I guess, going into this, I was very aware of the impact of the schools on really everyone in Inuit communities, especially whether people had gone to schools themselves or had family members, or just community members who had been to the school. So I had some sense anyway of the impact, the real importance of this experience of the schools. So going into this project, I guess I felt a huge sense of responsibility and accountability. As a non-Indigenous person myself, and an anthropologist, which is tainted,
Yes.
you know, anyway, I felt a really strong accountability to people to in telling the history of the boarding schools, to really center their stories and to honor their stories and to tell the history in a way that respected the way that they tell their stories. So going into these community sessions, each of them was very different. So we went to all the communities in Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador, Cartwright, Goose Bay, Northwest River, St. John's, and Ottawa. Each of them was very different. We always had a community feast first evening, and then the next day or the next day, a couple of days after that, we would have either community sessions, so group sessions where people could come in and talk as a group, or individual interviews with people, depending on the way things, the way things went. But I was amazed at the range of stories that we heard. In that it wasn't only really the boarding schools that people were talking about. It really set the boarding schools within this larger larger colonial history of other things that were going on. The boarding schools were an important part of it, but it was within a larger story. And so we heard heartbreaking stories sometimes. There was a lot of laughter in some cases too, and a lot of stories that really, as you said in your introduction, really reflected people's resilience and strength. And what really amazed me was hearing these difficult stories of childhood experiences, and then just looking at the people telling them, and they're these wonderful, beautiful people who are now leaders in their community and who have lived full and amazing lives, and just the resilience and their ability to go through difficult times and to come out. It's very strong people. It was amazing for me to see that. And so in writing the book, I really tried to reflect that it wasn't, this is not just stories of victims. People don't see themselves as victims at all.
No, I got the sense reading this that that's very much not what they see themselves as.
And got the sense too that it was a opportunity to know more about the people themselves. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. If you could give maybe a sense to our listeners about who the peoples of Labrador are, a little bit about the life before the boarding schools. The Inuit and Innu people had their own way of life, of course, their own culture, their own governance structures before the Europeans showed up and settled. Like so much of our Indigenous history, most Canadians know actually very little about these people. Most would conflate Inuit and Innu. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about these two cultures so we can get a better grasp of them?
Yeah. So the Inuit are coastal people. They're the same, they're related to people in Nunavut and Nunavik, northern Quebec, all across the Canadian Arctic. Traditionally they were whalers, seal hunters, very focused on the marine environment. And so they lived since, maybe, I don't know, 1500s, all throughout the coast of Labrador.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 1700s, the British wanted to establish a fishery down in southern Labrador. And so they brought Moravian missionaries to Labrador, and the Moravians tried to contain Inuit in northern Labrador, and they set up missions there. So what is now Nunatsiavut, which is the northern part, the northern coast of Labrador, is historically the Moravian Inuit, and the Inuit who are non-Moravian south of them are now the Nunatuavut Community Council. So the Inuit are under two political organizations right now. So that's the Inuit, and then the Innu are more. They live traditionally more inland. They are related to Innu throughout Quebec and northern Quebec and lower North Shore. And in Labrador, they were really late. They're probably one of the last Indigenous groups to be sort of forcibly settled in communities in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. So they lived in Davis Inlet on the coast of Labrador, and Chedji in central Labrador. Right. So the people of Davis Inlet are now living in Natwashish. So there are two communities in Labrador of Innu.
Can you say a word or two about, because I was taken by the sort of societal structure to Inuit in terms of the government, the way they govern themselves, the way they raise their children, all those sorts of things. Could you say a word or two about that?
Yeah, so traditionally Inuit and Innu raise their children very, I don't know if leniently is the right word, but the very gentle way of raising children. And they don't focus on punishment or corporal punishment or directing, controlling children. Their focus on raising children is more allowing a child to experience things, learn by experience, and follow their own interests. So of course that
had its own impact
quite a bit once you get into the boarding school stories or any kind of European style of education, which is mostly based on coercion and punishment and control.
Yes.
You mentioned the Moravians coming over and the beginning of that colonization. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Moravians, like their mission stations, and what was their influence on social transformation of these folks?
Yeah, so the Moravians are an early Protestant church. So they came in the 1770s, 1760s, 1770s to Labrador. They were German, North European, and British. And they, as I said, they worked with the British government to try and contain Inuit to the northern part of Labrador. So in 1771, they set up their first mission station in Nain, and then established other ones along the north coast. And they were traders as well. So they tried to get Inuit to come to their mission stations by having trading posts and drawing Inuit in that way. I think originally they had hoped to set up these communities where Inuit would live with them throughout the year, but they realized very quickly that that's not possible, that you need to be out on the land, supporting yourself, hunting, fishing, trapping. So they couldn't have Inuit with them, but they tried as much as they could to get Inuit to come to the mission stations for as long a period of time as possible. And that was often in the period between Christmas and Easter. So from very early on, from the 1770s, they established these day schools in the communities. So the children would go to school between Christmas and Easter when their families were in the stations with them.
Wow.
And all the schooling was in Inuktitut
Right.
in the early years.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They must have made their way into this part of Ontario too, because I know growing up in Kent County, there's a Moravian town.
That's correct.
Right. That's as soon as I heard that word, I connected that.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the two. When I moved to down here in '94 to go to school from Newfoundland and heard of Moravian town, Rob was like, "Oh, are they from Labrador? I thought they were all from Labrador. Moravians in Newfoundland. Oh, we hear Moravians, we think Labrador. You mentioned Nain. I got to say that perhaps of everything else I read in the book, the most gut-wrenching stuff for me was reading about that school in Nain. There was little doubt of the stated goal of the school. One of the missionaries there, Reverend Heddish, saw the school as a means to train and transform the children to fight the evils that surround them, he said, you wrote about. And Samuel Hutton, secretary of the British Mission Board in London, was very explicit about the colonial interest they had, on the other hand, which is, to make these folks British subjects. He described the Moravian approach to education is suited to the Inuit style lifestyle, but also as addressing the needs of the British Empire. Whether it was the Moravian missionaries' goal of producing future congregants or Britain's colonial thirst, both aimed really to use the boarding school as an agent to change the society. As you've said, the broader strokes of colonialism are sort of the things that really matter here. Again and again, it's stated by officials and clergy that the boarding house is needed in order to remove the interference of the parents. I mean, that's an incredible turn of phrase, interference of the parents. And the stories of children and work and lack of food, poor nutrition, berry, and all these sort of preventable things. It's heartbreaking stuff. Can you tell our listeners more about what life was like for the children in that school in Nain?
Yeah. So as I said, the Moravians, the missionaries, had been providing day schools for Inuit for 150 years almost, until the 1920s, mid 1920s, when things changed all of a sudden in northern Labrador, because the Hudson's Bay Company came in and took over the trading from the missionaries, from the Moravians.
And they have an amazing track record, by the way. Hudson's Bay Company. We had Jean Tellier on here, who wrote "The Northwest Is Our Mother." Ask her about the Hudson's Bay Company. Anyway, pardon me for the interruption, but
yeah. Well, so yes, when the Hudson's Bay Company took over, though, they wanted families out on the land, trapping as much as possible. They were interested in fur. So all of a sudden, the families couldn't come into the mission station between Christmas and Easter anymore. And so all of a sudden, their children were not going to school. And the Moravians, the missionaries, were very upset by this, because they did use the school. They could see the benefit of the school in molding children to the way they
proper Christian morals.
They wanted, yeah. So if they didn't have influence over the children anymore, they were at quite a loss. And so that's where the idea of a boarding school came in Nain they they built a boarding school and in 1928 and got children to stay with them for the school year while their parents were gone. So that school, so there was a dormitory, but then the school itself had an Inuktitut language school and an English language school. So depending on whether the children were Inuit or what they used to call settler families, which are mixed ancestry families, and often English speaking. So the children would live together in the dormitory, but the language in the dormitory was Inuktitut. So even children who are English speakers often learned Inuktitut by living in the dormitory. So it was always run without really adequate funding. The missionaries were always trying to do their best on very limited budgets. They got some funding for the boarding school from an American who spent time on that coast and who fundraised in the States for them. But there really wasn't that much funding available, and so the children often did a lot of the work, and that was partly financial. In order just to get the work done, they couldn't hire people. They didn't have the money to hire people. And it was also because the missionaries really felt that the children learned a lot by working, and they wanted to teach them. They wanted to teach the girls housekeeping skills, and so a lot of their time was spent doing, scrubbing floors and mending and cooking and all kinds of house chores, and the boys would be cutting wood and hauling water and doing that sort of work. Right. So that school, the dormitory sort of moved from building to building. They never really quite had proper housing for them. They always relied on donated buildings or buildings that had been used for other purposes, and they changed into dormitories. So it was a bare bones sort of operation. And I should say too, that the schools in Labrador, these boarding schools that we're talking about are different from the Canadian boarding schools because they were never under the Indian Act. So the federal government wasn't paying for anything in this case.
Oh, okay. One of the interesting observations, kind of pick up the thread of the kids in school and such, is around in your book is around the use of this idea of punishment for speaking English, right? And among the most painful stories told of residential schools, certainly here in southwestern Ontario, were of children being beaten if they spoke their mother tongue. And Kevin was talking about, we didn't learn these things in school. I didn't hear that until I was like in my 40s that was even, going on. But anyway, they're forced to speak English. Survivors of the school in Nain speak of being beaten if they spoke English because the missionaries wanted them to speak Inuktitut. Am I pronouncing that right? I think I'm close. Yeah. So one of the earliest translated documents was the Bible, and the children would learn the Bible stories and in their mother tongue. Can you maybe lend some context to this for us?
Yeah. So the missionaries the Moravians were very adamant that Inuit continue speaking Inuktitut, and literacy was a huge part of the education. So the literacy rate in Northern Labrador was quite high all through the 1800s, for instance. So all the education was in Inuktitut. And the Moravians, I think, or the missionaries, really didn't want Inuit to learn English because I think they felt, first of all, that was a sort of, it would somehow make them less Inuit. They had these ideas of cultural purity, and that
Right.
would change that in their minds. And I think it was also a matter of control too. If Inuit learned how to speak English, then they could speak to the Newfoundland fishermen who would come up every summer, or Americans or whoever, and then they would maybe interact with people that the missionaries didn't want them interacting with. It was a control thing, I think, to a certain extent. So yeah, until the 1940s, the missionaries in Nain were quite strict on trying to ensure that the children didn't learn English. And so it is amazing to hear, because so many of the other stories, as you said, are about,
it's a shocking difference from
the other way. Other way.
We've gone through a lot of truth and reconciliation work here in southwestern Ontario, and the Anglican Church here, of which we're a part. Of course, we were complicit and participated and ran these schools, and we had clergy beating children for speaking English, right? So I mean, for speaking Cree, for instance, or like if they spoke their mother tongue, they got beaten. And so when I read that, it was like, this is so interesting. But thank you for picking up on the real issue is. It's not whether it was English or Inuktitut or Cree or whatever. It was, how can we use language to actually control you and mold you into what we want you to be?
And to stop relationships from happening, or connections. Right? It was very controlling in that way.
Exactly.
Among the more powerful stories, listen, that's one of the things I wanted to say about your book, is the stories, the personal testimonies and all that. Oh my gosh, it's just, to me, it's an important part of this for those of us who are descendants, who are settlers of Newfoundland and Labrador, to come to understand the impact of colonialization on the lives of people who are alive today, to talk about it. I mean, that's the thing that, of course, you often hear these tropes from people like, well, that was so long ago. Why are we talking about that now?
When you hear the personal stories, when you hear somebody tell their own experience,
break your heart. Sarah Webb is one of those stories that took my breath away. Sarah and her brothers decided one day in December in Labrador to run away from the boarding school and return to Webb's Bay, 35 kilometers from Nain. Can you share that story, or at least a gist of it, with our listeners? Because it is really quite and I understand a story of legend on the coast down there.
It's an amazing thing. So Sarah and I think 4 of her brothers and another friend of theirs were at the boarding school, and so this wasn't pre-planned. I think they said they're just out sledding one day, and they decided, well, why don't we just walk home like you would, right?
30, just a John up the road here.
And so they just walked, and they were I don't know what the age range, but say 12 to 6 or something. Like, they were very young, not even teenagers really. And they walked it in, they made it, but she said they were really lucky, because right when they got home, a big snowstorm hit. And she said, of course, people in Nain were looking for them and were trying to follow their tracks, and lost their tracks in an area of open water. And, people were in the church praying, and they thought they were lost. They thought they were dead. But they got home, and the missionaries eventually did catch up with them. And I think because it was just before Christmas, the Webb family, the Webb kids, were allowed to stay home until after Christmas. The one girl who wasn't a Webb had to come back.
Incredible.
But well, and that story is told over and over again now in Nain. It's amazing. I can't imagine that walk.
In 1956, Moravian, International Grenfell Association, and provincial officials put their heads together. They came up with a plan that can only be described, I think, as social engineering. They basically argued that fishing and hunting as a way of life was outdated, and that the Inuit north of Nain should relocate to southern communities. And Reverend Peacock saw this as a way of, quote, civilizing unquote, the Inuit. And I wanted to read a little bit from the book, if I could, Andrea, and then ask a question of you on this. You write, without consulting the people of Newtak and Hebron, the three agencies decided to move the Northern Inuit to southern communities. They envisioned a future in which Inuit lived in large communities, worked at wage jobs, and had easy access to healthcare, housing, and education. And while the Moravians' schools had focused on educating children to live as far as possible in the traditional manner of the Eskimos, as chairperson of the conference, Frederick Rode described a new and modern approach was needed. And he said that today the aim is to equip them to take their place as citizens and to absorb them into our society without violence to the native culture. So the result of that was that Newtak was closed in 1956, and the people of the surrounding area were forced to move south. And then Hebron followed in 1959, and the Inuit were ousted from their homeland and expected to build new lives in the south. And they displaced, this is incredible, 158 people from Okak Bay and 233 people from Hebron to new and foreign environments, forcing them to adapt a village-based lifestyle. Can you talk a little bit about the impact this had? I can't imagine that it was not absolutely horrifying for those folks.
Yeah, it really was. And that those two relocations are one of the pivotal times in Labrador history, really just completely traumatic. So the people in both of those places, in Hebron and Okak Bay, were Inuit or Inuktitut speakers, completely. Almost many didn't know any English. The environment there is very rich, very full of good fishing, good char area, a lot of seals, no trees. It's very, it's above the tree line. So for them to be moved south to communities often that were treed completely environmentally different. So they were promised when they were moved they were promised houses and jobs. And of course, the jobs didn't happen. The houses eventually happened, but were very substandard, poor housing conditions. So the move and it just disrupted completely the social fabric of all of these families. They were broken up too. The families would be, some members would be put in one community and other members in another community. Mm-hmm. So it caused huge upset and devastation in every possible way you can think of. The communities were often English speaking too. So the children all of a sudden were put in English only schools. People didn't know where to hunt, didn't know how to hunt, or the fishing areas had already been taken, so they were just all of a sudden left in these communities and had no way of supporting themselves, lost all their the authority, the position in the community that they had originally. And
it's exile, isn't it? Really, it's
absolutely, yeah, that's what they call it. They see themselves being exiled.
So what comes to mind, of course, when you talk about that is Davis Inlet, on a different note, I suppose, but what's coming to my mind as a Newfoundlander is, the generational impacts of moving people to places. And I think about Sheshiji and Davis Inlet and the generational trauma. These are people who, and in the South, the Roman Catholic Church had a large impact in terms of what was being done and not done. the Innu on the north side of Northwest River were shifted to the south side, which is Sheshiji. In Davis Inlet, you describe efforts to again civilize the Innu. If you're from Newfoundland, Labrador, you know the generational consequences. Like I said, I mean, Davis Inlet now has been moved again. Can you talk a little bit about that generational reality, how that gets played out? I mean, as you just said about those moving from the north to the south and Davis Inlet and others, I mean, people sometimes look at what's happening in terms of the ills that are in these communities and are quick to cast judgment on cultures. But in reality, we've reaped what we've sown as a colonial people, no?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just that, just being forced to move from somewhere where you're completely self-sufficient, you can support your family, you can feed your children, you have the ability and the autonomy to make your own decisions, to go from that to all of a sudden being forced to live in a community or in a place that's completely foreign, where you all of a sudden have no ability to look after your family, to feed your family, to make those decisions. That has huge impact on anyone, and so often that leads to self destructive behaviors and shame and which leads to trauma within the family. If your parents are going through difficult times like that, then
And this is the point that
the impact. And
this is the point, to get back to what Kevin said, that we hear the language around, well, why are we talking about this? Because it's not a thing that happened. It's
a thing that's happening.
It's generational, in that the pain that was inflicted then is still relevant and very much alive today. And so it's not about just an event in history. Yeah. It's but what's going on in communities today.
And especially when you consider, as Andrea said earlier, about, prior to the 1700s, there was a whole societal structure. There was a way of being, generation to generation, a way of instructing, of teaching, of disciplining or not, of governing and all that stuff. And the whole thing has been torn to shreds. And now generation after generation has been engineered by religious people and government people to try and be like others. And that has a long-lasting deleterious effect on not just on individuals, but on a whole culture.
Yeah. And the schooling, of course, plays into that, because if you're taught in school that there's something inherently wrong with your parents and the way that your family is, and then you start to think, oh, maybe there is, maybe, you feel shame about who you are, who your family is. And then that has lifelong impacts.
That's right.
People talk about having that experience in school and then having to relearn the pride in themselves and in Indigenous culture. That I think is one of the main effects, unfortunate effects of all of this.
I want to just touch on Wilford Grenfell, if we can. Sir Wilford Grenfell. Growing up in Newfoundland, Grenfell is legend. I mean, the floating hospital, the whole thing. The Grenfell mission was a thing of legend for us. He was known as charismatic and determined. And he certainly had great influence in Great Britain, in the United States, in Canada. He was well connected. I have to say, reading your book, I've come away with a very different picture of Sir Wilford Grenfell than the one that I went into it with. And which just speaks, I mean, I just turned 50 years of age. And as much as I've known about Wilford Grenfell was that, oh boy, he did a lot of real good stuff up on the coast of Labrador. And that's it. I was today years old when I read, this stuff about Grenfell in the book. Perhaps most shocking to me is the realization that, the orphanage in St. Anthony was not really full of orphans, but full of people who were taken from their dad or their mom because they'd lost one parent, or from parent to parents if Grenfell felt they couldn't manage, or to take children from families and bring them to the United States and foster them, or to Canada, and so on, and to use them in materials to raise money, and it's just shocking, really. Can you talk to us a little bit about Grenfell and the legacy, and give a sense of what some of those survivors went through? Because you've got stories in there, people who were away for 2-3 years, lost their parents while they were in the United States, were never told that their dad had died, and that sort of thing. Can you share some of that?
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing about Wilford Grenfell was that he was an amazing storyteller, and that he was very, very good at presenting his side of the story. And his organization had to do endless fundraising, and so they put out magazines and he put out books, and they told the story that we all hear, that he was a hero, and the poor people of Labrador are so thankful for the work that he did. And of course he did, and there was a lot of good work that was done. You can't deny that. The thing was that there was the government wasn't there. The Newfoundland government had left the coast of Labrador to its own devices. Really, they were not providing any sort of assistance. So there was a vacuum. At least the Grenfell Association saw that and came in and were happy to act as the heroes and the saviors of the people. So that story is very well told and is the one that we hear. But as you said, listening to the stories of people who were on the receiving end of this generosity, they have different opinions of the matter, right? So
Yes.
And there was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of malnutrition. That was the reality. And so, yeah, when one parent died in a family, that did have a huge impact. And the thing was, though, with the Grenfell Association, they didn't involve local people. They made decisions often just unilaterally, and Grenfell was very quick to come in and make decisions on himself about family members and where this child should go and where that child should go. And he thought, and the association thought, that they were doing the best thing possible. They were saving children. That's really what they saw. And so, yeah, in the early years anyway, the approach was to send children. So they adopted children out if they could manage to do that, to the States or to Britain. And they also organized education for children. So for the very brightest of the children in Labrador, they would send them to college in the States, and they got an education and often would come back and work for the International Grenfell Association. So again, a very paternalistic way of approaching things, and there was no accountability. There was no government involved. The IGA was doing what it wanted, pretty much on its own, and there was no local involvement in making any of these decisions. So very problematic.
Sure. Oh yeah, very much so.
Far more complex than you or I learned in grade 5 history. Let's
Yeah, it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I thought Andrea, we'd wrap up, just take a quick look at where things are now. We made mention earlier about the federal government's apology in 2017 that Prime Minister Trudeau gave, which was to correct that injustice of the no apology in 2008. And so your book, your work are pieces of efforts to work toward reconciliation, but there's still a lot of work that remains, we know. Other parties have yet to step forward, and we've been talking about the Moravians, the Moravian Church, the IGA, the International Grenfell Association, Newfoundland and Labrador government. They've all played central roles in establishing and running these institutions well before the federal government was involved. So can you give us an indication maybe of where things sit with these three parties today? And I mean, do you see any hope of apologies perhaps coming from them?
Yeah. So in the last few decades, anyway, both the Moravian Mission and the International Grenfell Association have stepped back. I think they've realized that their approach, and both of them were quite paternalistic in assuming authority over people's lives, and so both of the organizations stepped back and involved more local people into the decision-making process. In terms of an apology, there's been really no sense for either of those organizations that an apology is forthcoming. The provincial government, though, has said that they are going to apologize, and I know they've been consulting with Indigenous governments in Labrador about it. I'm not sure what the latest on it is. It hasn't happened yet, and I'm sure it will happen at some point, but it's yet to be seen.
Right. And what does education look like in Labrador today?
Yeah. So both of the Inuit governments, the Nunatsiavut government and Nunatsiavut Community Council, have been taking on more and more control over the education in their communities. And in Nunatsiavut, there's a lot of Inuktitut in school now. They've reintroduced that. And there are programs in all parts of Nunatsiavut and Nunatsiavut, programs including cultural skills and on the land training and more and more curriculum that reflects the local reality. Inuit communities have taken over education altogether. Actually, there's an Innu school board that runs the schools in Natoshish and Sheji. And there's a lot of Inuimun in the schools, a lot of cultural curriculum in those schools. So there's been quite a shift and a lot of local control now over education.
Oh, good. Well, Andrea, hey, you've been so generous with your time today. Get the book up here. And again, not only just history, but the stories, right? The stories of people. I really would recommend this for folks. And that's a beautiful cover too, that beautiful child. That's lovely. So that's great. Andrea, thanks so much.
I do hope and pray that people who go to university are picking this up in some courses, I hope. And I hope that high schools are looking at this book. And I hope that teachers of elementary schools are reading this book. This is an important part of the history of the part of the world where I grew up, a province that I grew up in anyway, and it's missing. It's a history that's not been told. And you clearly have a great deal of respect amongst the Innu and Inuit people that they would bring you into their story and trust you with it. And you've honored them well with an incredible piece of work. And we thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for that.
That's great. Yeah. Andrea Proctor, A Long Journey, Residential Schools in Labrador and Newfoundland. Thanks for being on the Vickers Crossing.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So that was fascinating stuff, interesting, and history that, as we've said so many times, needs to be told, taught, and shared because we didn't get it.
Well,
it took a long time. I remember I think about how I'd be and understand and see the world and Indigenous communities if I had just an inkling of this growing up.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking that like the vitriol on social media about Red Indian Lake in Newfoundland would be very different today if my generation were raised with
Right.
this sort of information.
Yeah.
Right. But
so true.
instead it's
True.
just, it goes to 150 miles an hour in a minute
Mm. Yep.
because we don't know, we haven't heard the stories, and we
Right.
think we know. And the other thing that was fascinating to me with this and Andrea was just the, you know, I mean, this is a different story than the story we've all come to know here in Southwestern Ontario, for instance. But the thread that runs through it is the need for colonial settler peoples to control, manipulate, and engineer people to make
Right.
them like the British Empire.
Right.
Or
Exactly.
you know.
Right. And when the language is around, like they visioned something for the Inuit people or the Inuit
Yeah.
people, they
Yeah.
visioned, they had a
Yeah,
vision
yeah,
for
yeah.
it. You
Well,
know,
when
not that they didn't have one before,
No.
right? Of course, that it was our vision.
Or when
yeah.
when Wilford Grenfell shows up and says, "No, this is what's best for your child, and
Right, this is-
we're
yeah.
taking her now.
Yeah, we know what's best.
We're going to send her to New York. Hopefully, you get to see her again. We don't know." And
Yeah.
oh, by the way, you died. Oh, we forgot to tell her. She came
Yeah,
back and
yeah.
found out you're dead. I mean, these things are
Unbelievable. Well, thanks to Andrea, and thanks to you for being part of our podcast today, everybody. We want to thank our sponsors again, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maids. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here, St. Aidan's Church.
All right. And Kevin, remember to always look both ways
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!